And now, let's get back to Dave White Presents.
And that was Waltz the Halls Always, a little song that came out from a band called Game Theory. It was produced about 1984. And the odds are pretty good you might have missed it the first time around. Back from 1982 to 1990, Game Theory was a band that put out 5 studio albums and several EPs and got a lot of great critical reviews. It was something of a cult band for a college audience. But didn't really shake up a whole lot of commercial noise then. And in fact, for about 25 years, all of the Game Theory albums were out of print until last year when our friends at Omnivore Records decided to bring out all of the Game Theory albums, and they're coming out in sequence. The song you just heard, Waltz the Hall Always, came from an album called Real Nighttime. But, there's quite a story to Game Theory, and to tell you all about it, somebody who was there, and that was the guy who was their road manager and their sound engineer during that time, and he's co-producer of all these Omnivore reissues. So let's introduce Dan Vallor and bring him on deck. So, hi, Dan, and welcome to Dave White Presents.
Sorry. Hi, Wes. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. So let's talk a little bit about the history of Game Theory. I take it you weren't around when they put out that first studio album, but I guess Blaze of Glory's got kind of an interesting tale to it, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, Scott had a band previously.
Scott Miller that he's met.
Scott Miller had a band previously called Alternate Learning, and they had put out an EP and an LP on their own. And I had heard these through a very influential record shop in Berkeley called Rather Ripped. And I had become a huge fan prior to Game Theory's existence already. So I eventually met Scott through a mutual friend when they came down to San Francisco and played a show at a club called the I-Beam. This was right after Blaze of Glory came out.
And that was very much a do-it-yourself sort of album that he kind of recorded in his mother's house. In fact, there's places on the record you can hear vacuum cleaners and trapping.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. They recorded it at a couple of places, as I understand it. Both his childhood bedroom. He was living in Davis at the time, but his family was from Sacramento. And they recorded it in his childhood bedroom or where he grew up, and also in the drummer's living room. So it was all done on 4-track, very, very homemade DIY kind of record.
And when they packaged it, was kind of different from most of your issues, isn't it?
Yeah, the packaging initially was just white kitchen trash bags with a sticker pasted to the front, a sticker to the back, and a twist tie at the top holding it together, and then an insert with the lyrics. And I think that the band thought that that would be a novel way to package a record. Novel ways to package records were kind of in vogue back in 1982, 83. And Scott's first band, Alternate Learning, had put out an EP that was elaborately packaged in a 7-inch package with about 15 inserts and all sorts of things. So he really liked design. Unfortunately, I think that trash bag design was a little too unwieldy for record shops. So the record ultimately sold out, but a lot of the record stores were a little bit uneasy with the way it was packaged. It was difficult to put on the wall. They wouldn't stay, that sort of thing.
Well, so about that time is when you came into the mix, right?
So once we met, he and I became pretty fast friends, very fast friends. And so I started spending time up in Davis and Sacramento and started working for the band. I had already actually done tours with a couple bands from Los Angeles, just brief tours with a band called the Rain Parade and the Long Riders, and I'd done a tour with a band called the Tau Falco's Panther Burns, which included one of Scott's and my heroes, Alex Chilton.
Oh, yeah.
So I had some experience on the road and working with bands, and between his and my friendship and my background, I kind of inserted myself in the mix and went to work for Game Theory. I was a big champion of theirs, and I wanted to see them succeed.
So at that point, they continued on recording, but they kind of had a difficult time grasping their audience. Can you kind of describe the sound of Game Theory and why it was so unique at the time?
Well, they were very, what is now called, and I think then sort of called power pop, but smarter lyrics than a lot of power pop, very complex melodies. Scott's influences were widespread. He had a lot of affection for Roxy music and Brian Eno and 70s era Sparks, but also Big Star and the Velvet Underground and so forth. So he, and of course David Bowie. So he was kind of all over the place in terms of what inspired him. He was somebody who was incredibly bright, kind of a polymath, I guess would be the right word to use. So he was involved in pretty much all aspects of what he was doing, the artwork, the record, writing the press materials and so forth. I think what was kind of happening in the music world, or the indie world, the college radio world, was that things were turning kind of roots rock after the initial punk rock and post-punk blast. Things were going in a kind of direction that was either psychedelic or roots rock. And Game Theory had a keyboard sound that was a little bit out of sync with that. In time, I think, particularly now, it sounds more today than it did then.
I would say, too, that one of the things that jumped out at me in the albums that I've heard is that Scott Miller was very experimental and had lots of complex arrangements that probably jolted radio listeners' ears. Is that fair assessment?
I think so. You know what? It's funny that you say that. One of the things that when people question the lack of success of game theory versus the enormous success of R.E.M. and the success of bands like Michael's 3 O'Clock and Mitch Easter, who produced all of the rest of the Game Theory Records band, Let's Active, I point to that really Scott was writing in a given one song. In any one song, he was writing probably enough melody changes for anyone else to get 2 songs, maybe 3 songs in some cases out of them. But changes and surprises were something that both he and I were quite fond of in the bands that we listened to. Just unique ideas that would surprise you coming around to bend on a song, you know, something that you just weren't expecting to hear.
Now, this was a band that kind of changed lineups rather frequently, with some folks kind of in and out somewhat consistently. Who do you think the other main motors in the sound were beyond Scott Miller?
Well, initially, Nan Becker and Scott worked extensively on arrangements, and Fred Uhosh was the bassist in the initial lineup, and he actually contributed a couple songs to the first EP, a song to the second EP, and recorded a song for the second album, Real Nighttime. But Scott very much wanted a democratic kind of environment for a band. So he wanted input from everybody that was involved. Ultimately, the first lineup kind of imploded on that first tour. We actually went out and did a 5-week national tour in support of the second EP, which was pretty much a self-release. Well, Scott Vanderbilt, the manager, had released it. The band had not put out a record on Enigma Records yet, which was much more widely distributed. At the time we went out, there was a French label that had combined the first 2 EPs that had released an album, and that's something that Omnivore has since reissued in a sort of reimagined way called Dead Center. So that was out there for the East Coast, and the EPs were out there for the West Coast. But we went out on the road in 1984, right after Real Nighttime was recorded, did 5 weeks. It ended fairly disastrously with us losing a lot of dates, with the hope of getting an opening slot for Let's Active on the way back. That didn't come through.
You guys carried on till 1990 when Scott and Gather decided enough of game theory and created the Loud family, right?
Well, the band, the lineup that had recorded Big Shot Chronicles held together, with the exception of bassist Susie Ziegler, who had left the band after that tour, and then Donette Thayer and the bassist Guy, and I'm not going to try and pronounce Guy's last name, had joined up, and they recorded 2 additional albums, the double album Lolita Nation, which, if there were to be the supremely experimental album, Lolita Nation is it, but it's still full of great pop songs. And then Two Steps from the Middle Ages. And then that band disintegrated, and final band formed, which actually the 3 O'Clock had since broken up. So the final band was Scott, Michael Quercio, the singer for 3 O'Clock, Joe Becker, who was Scott's childhood friend and who had drummed for Thin White Rope, and then Gil Ray, who had been in Game Theory since the Real Nighttime tour and the Big Shot Chronicles recording. So that final lineup never actually ended up releasing any material, something that we aim to correct with the reissue series on Omnivore. Our final release is planned to be a documentation of that lineup.
Now, since you mentioned Omnivore, why was it that all these records were out of print for 25 years, and what prompted Omnivore to, I guess, ask you or whoever was all involved to reproduce all the Game Theory records?
Well, the albums had initially been out on Enigma, and Enigma had been distributed by Capitol Records. And the records were really owned by the manager, Scott Vanderbilt. He kept them under his own label, but licensed them to Enigma, where he'd since gone to work as a VP. Briefly, in the early to mid-90s, while Scott was in his subsequent band, the Loud Family, the label that the Loud Family recorded for, Alias Records, reissued a couple of the albums. But they didn't remain in print for very long. And so they did come out briefly in the early 90s or the mid-90s, came and went, I would say. And in the interim period, in around 1999, the Loud Family split, and Scott Vanderbilt had left the music industry, and they kind of just fell out of print. And I was approached by Pat Thomas, who's one of my co-producers at Omnivore, and he was very, very much enthusiastic about doing the reissues. Scott and I, prior to Scott's passing, had really wanted to get these albums back out. We were just trying to find the right label to do it. And once Pat approached me, it just seemed like a great fit. They were doing a lot of interesting things. They were releasing Big Star. They were releasing the Dream Syndicate. They were releasing the 3 O'Clock. And they were also releasing a lot of interesting things that were not part of the same crowd of people that we knew.
And when you guys put these packages together, I've noticed, at least so far, you guys really release everything. You got the original albums plus tons of bonuses. In fact, there's more bonus features on Real Nighttime and Blaze of Glory than there are the actual album itself, right?
Well, I was a rather obsessive archivist, I guess is the best way to put it. On the road, while I was mixing sound, I was recording virtually every show. Scott and I would make tapes at home, like just solo tapes, things like that. We'd record rehearsals. I thought that there was really something there. So one day there might be some really good reason to have all this stuff. So it actually turned out to be a great thing to have been keeping all that record.
Yeah, I noticed you got a version of Baker Street on the Real Nighttime collection.
Yeah, I really love that. When that was a hit, I was kind of lukewarm on it, and maybe I just have maybe that kind of saxophone doesn't really connect with me. But there's something just so sad in that lyric, and the original version kind of conveyed that, but the tone and the pacing of the Game Theory version really, I think, brings out that sort of melancholy nature of that lyric, and I think that's a really beautiful version.
Yeah, it is. In fact, one of the bonuses, I think beauty is a good word for it, because they're kind of sometimes very plaintive and sometimes virtual ballads. It's a very melodic collection. Yeah, which leads me to, I guess, pretty much my last question. Who are these reissues going to appeal to? Power pop fans, Paisley Underground fans, or do you see a broader audience for Game Theory?
Well, I see a broader audience. They were overlooked in their time, but they've had some pretty substantial, and Scott has had some pretty substantial influence on songwriters. I've been in touch with Carl Newman from the New Pornographers and Will Sheff from Ockerville River. Ken Stringfellow is going to be contributing from the Posies, is going to be contributing some writing to a future album. And Amy Mann has been a huge supporter of Scott. I think she told the Boston Globe that when she writes a song, she thinks, what would Scott think of this? That he was, to her, the finest songwriter that was living when he was still with us.
Yeah, I was just thinking that people who weren't born yet, the latest album at least, is very, very key to 20-year-olds. In fact, one song is called 24, and a lot of it seems to be about those early days of getting out of college and joining the real world. And, of course, that's a perennial thing, but it's not one that's, too typical of many albums. But because of that those useful themes and tropes in the album, why wouldn't these songs resonate with current 20-somethings?
Yeah, I think that album particularly is this. It kind of encapsulates the whole feeling of that period in one's life, and the trying to find one's place amongst the many choices and the many worlds that exist when you're young and you've got your life in front of you and you're a little confused. And I think that album really sort of hits that nail on the head.
Yeah, that's one thing I noticed throughout it. Well, I guess we're just about out of time, so we need to run out with one more sample from the current reissue, Real Nighttime. And I guess that's Frontierland, which I kind of picked because it's very, very different from Waltz Through the Halls, because that one was pretty much rock and roll. Frontierland's a bit more, I don't know what the word for it would be, alternative pop ballad sort of thing. Do you know the story behind that song at all?
I really don't know where that was coming from. There's all sorts of references to academic things and obviously foreshadow that sort of idea of Lolita Nation, the later album, which will be coming soon.
So I presume that we're going to be seeing the rest of the Game Theory catalog coming out here in 2015 via Omnivore?
In 2015 and 2016 from here, we have 3 more released albums, all of which will be expanded. Those are Lolita Nation, Big Shot Chronicles, and 2 Steps from the Middle Ages.
All right, folks. Well, you got kind of a tip of the iceberg whirlwind tour of a band that you missed in the 80s whose time may have finally come. And you heard one sample and one side of them with the song we came in with. And now we're going to have Curse of Frontierland, which has got another dimension to Scott Miller and Game Theory. And hopefully you'll, check out the Dave White Presents webpage. And in the Persons of Interest page, we'll have a link to where you can find Game Theory and find out more about a band that you probably never met before. So I guess with that, we'll say thanks to Dan Vallor, and here's Curse of the Frontierland.
list goes too far. German genius, Paris jet set, breaking down our door.
All right, away we went, and now we are gone. That is it. 2 rings is all for this edition of DWP. Thanks for listening. Be back in 2 weeks when the circus will once again be back to a full 3 rings. Wes and I will see you then when Dave White presents.
Dave White Presents is an audio entertainment group production.